Hey Unwrappers, just before we begin this week's show, I wanted to let you know about the daily digital digests, also from the week. With everything you need to know in one balanced read, the week's daily digital digests give you space to reflect on the news, away from the noise. You can try 6 weeks for free in our winter sale and then save an extra 30% on an annual digital or print and digital subscription. Just enter the offer code WINTER at theweek.com/offer to start your free trial today. That's theweek.com/offer and the offer code WINTER. And now on with the show. It's the week ending Friday the 21st of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Donald Trump calling Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator as face-to-face talks between the US and Russia begin, Hamas handing over the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages, including 2 children, and the BAFTA for Best Film going to Conclave. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Harriet Marsden and Rebecca Messina, and we welcome back BBC Sport journalist Emma Smith. Now, the news agenda continues to be pretty dark, and unbelievably, it is also still winter. So I'm curious, what have you all been lightening the mood with this week?
I mean, not necessarily lightening the mood, but I've been moving house, which in most circumstances would be incredibly stressful, but compared to following the news agenda has been light relief. And I'm all moved in, so it's all lovely.
Rebecca, have you got anything that's been, just helping your brain take a holiday?
I would say 5 words: Married at First Sight, Australia.
There we go. That's what I was looking for. That in a new kitchen, you've got it sorted. Harriet, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The sinking feeling that we could be next.
I don't feel like it's ever going to be safe for me to go back into it. Honestly, when you look out, that's kind of where my children's bedrooms are, and it just doesn't feel safe anymore.
One resident of Godstone in Surrey speaking to Sky News on Wednesday. Harriet, what's happened there?
Drama in Surrey. So on Monday night in this village, the sinkhole appeared on the high street, and by Tuesday lunch it had grown to about 25 metres across and swallowed up an entire garden, and a load of villagers had to evacuate their homes because of the risk of an explosion or fire from the exposed cables, and it actually cut off the water supply to a load of homes because it burst a main water pipe. And today a second hole has opened up nearby, and that one could be getting bigger as well.
So how many sinkholes are we talking then? What are the stats?
One of the really interesting things about these sinkholes actually is that we don't really have accurate stats. Like, they're not generally always recorded. They're not always making the news agenda, but we do know that they're becoming increasingly common. We do also know that Ripon in Yorkshire, for example, which is known as the sinkhole capital of the UK, has had
That's the thing putting you down, isn't it?
30 collapses in the city in the past 150 years or so. So we don't have exact numbers. They are quite mysterious, and they are not that well tracked unless they make the news, but they are becoming increasingly common.
Rebecca, you've been having a look into just how isolated these things are, though. What have you found?
Yeah, so the biggest factor for susceptibility to sinkholes is geology, what's the ground under our feet made up of, because sinkholes happen broadly when water dissolves the rock, creating a depression that drags down the surface level of sort of clay and soil. The thing that's changing is essentially, it's lots of things, but a big part of it is water, more extreme weather events generally. That includes heavier rainfall, we're seeing those sort of tropical downpours that permeates the surface to become groundwater. And that's not just creating new cavities, but it also weakens this whole invisible underground network of man-made ones. Stuff like mine shafts, sewers, all kinds of earthwork, stuff that's related to Britain's industrial past. For instance, one of the largest sinkholes that's opened up in recent years in 2023, it was 35 metres across. It opened up in a children's playground in Buckinghamshire, luckily with no children in it. And that is thought to have been a former chalk mine or clay pit from the area's brickmaking industry. So these are actually, technically, they're called crown holes rather than sinkholes because they're related to man-made cavities. But most of the big scary ones that make the news are examples of that.
And how lethal could they be, Emma? Because, I mean, as Rebecca said, even in that playground case, again, we seem to have these instances pop up and luckily no injuries, but it doesn't take much imagination to think someone could have been in that car, someone could have been on that swing.
Yeah, it's a weird thing with sinkholes because they are obviously quite terrifying in sort of the idea that the ground underneath you could open up. But the last recorded death in the UK, according to an article in the Telegraph in the UK, was in 1936. And in fact, sinkholes have sometimes been sort of a source of fun. There was a case in 1988 in which a double-decker bus was swallowed by a sinkhole, but no one was injured.
Where's the fun bit?
The fun bit is that Cadbury, having seen that there was no loss of life, decided to use it in an ad campaign, and for their chocolate bar of the same name, only a double-decker can fill a hole.
I see, right.
So... And it's sort of this weird incongruity that, yes, sinkholes are on a base level quite scary, but they're not lethal. The greatest issue with sinkholes is how massively inconvenient they are for people's lives.
Well, that's not true to say they're not deadly, though.
Okay, sure, but in the UK.
Yeah, it's worth saying, I think, that the ones that we have opening up all over Guatemala City, for example, which is really, really, really susceptible to sinkholes, and it's becoming increasingly common, there have been multiple deaths. There have been holes the size of city blocks. So they can be deadly. It's just like, as Emma was saying, it's almost luck that there haven't been more fatalities in the UK, because if a sinkhole opens up and swallows your house, it's luck whether or not there are people inside it.
Why do we fear them so much in the UK, though? Because that does seem to be the reaction on social media to this story. I mean, obviously, it's a very impressive image, isn't it? But, what is the cause of people's fascination with them, Rebecca? Is it fear that, we could all be swallowed up, a kind of anxiety that draws us to this story?
Honestly, I think really it boils down to the fact that we don't have as much to worry about as lots of other places in the world. Do you know what I mean? I think it's almost something that we can treat as something out of a horror film. Yeah, that sense of the unexpected, that sense that you're never safe, you're walking around living your everyday life. Oh God, a sinkhole's opened up underneath you. That is something that, it's not fun. It's that same thing as the double-decker, right? It's not fun, but it captures the imagination in a way that I think more pedestrian, depressing news stories certainly don't. And the very fact that the UK hasn't, in sort of nearly 100 years now, experienced a sinkhole fatality means that it's almost a safe dread for us to kind of toy with.
But I suppose it also teaches us a little bit, as Rebecca was saying, Emma, earlier, about our history. You get to find out what was underneath what is now a road or a motorway or an innocuous-looking street. But, of course, that speaks to our future as well. We're increasing the numbers of housing developments in this country. The government is telling us to build on brownfields. This used to be a sand quarry, I understand.
Yes, so obviously once the sinkholes are opening up in Godstone, there was investigation as to how that could happen, and it turns out that many of the evacuated properties are new built, only built 3 years or so ago, and are on the site of a former sand quarry. And the issue seems to have been that there was a burst or a leak in a water pipe. It eroded the ground underneath these houses and led to this sinkhole.
And the ground, by the way, still looks like sand. I mean, I'm not an engineer, I don't understand these things, but just looking at the picture, that looks like a sand pit to me. I kind of think, why are you building a house on that at all?
Yeah, they're very light, the sort of the rock underneath the roads and stuff like that. It does look like it's been built on, literally building a house on sand, which, as everyone who's heard that proverb knows, is not a good idea. And because we are needing more housing, and there's sort of, urban expansion, there is a greater risk that we are going to have to build more houses on more ground that's not necessarily perfect, or in some cases could be quite unsuitable for housing, which creates the risk of sinkholes growing more, common if more and more houses and urban developments are being built on ground that might not be necessarily the most stable.
Which might be good news to NIMBYs, Harriet, because, how do you mitigate risk like this? Well, you have more bureaucracy, don't you? Have more regulation. That's the very thing the government's saying they won't do.
I don't think NIMBYs need any more arsenal, to be honest with you. I will say that the thing that I think is really interesting about this story, which I didn't know, actually, and I'm sure that everyone else did know this, so I'm really sorry if this is really stupid, but I actually didn't realise that when they closed all the mines, they didn't fill them, that they only capped them. Did everyone else know that? I didn't know that. You could spot the London there. Anyway, so because they capped all of these mines, what I think is fascinating is it's these kind of scars of our past industrialization, that it's just underground, just below the surface of the ground in this country is just riddled with all of these old mines, mine shafts, quarries, sewers, even air raid shelters, and they weren't filled. So I think what fascinates people about these sinkholes is not just that very primal fear of the ground opening up underneath your feet, like something you really take for granted is kind of the stability of the ground under your feet. Just that primal fear, that learned survival technique of trusting gravity and trusting your feet it is very scary. But also, I think a really big issue here is the kind of inability to deal with this problem. It so speaks to so many other issues in the country, everything from potholes to like house building targets. This difficulty in actually dealing with stuff because it's not really clear whose responsibility it is. If a sinkhole opens up on your street, is it the council? Is it central government, emergency workers? Is it insurers? Like, who is supposed to deal with it? And these can cost like up to millions of pounds to deal with.
Yeah, some of the victims on the news were saying that they're negotiating with their insurer now, kind of out of the goodness of their hearts. What will they offer them? You know, it's not clear that they're owed anything.
Yeah, it's this very weird tussle. And I think it's very indicative of a lot of the issues that we have in Britain is that there's kind of this passing the buck, but also this incredible like levels and levels of bureaucracy. It's not really clear whose responsibility in it. It's led to this kind of what the Telegraph article that Emma mentioned has called this culture of agreed silence. Like we're all just sort of hoping that more sinkholes don't appear. And we're all just sort of hoping we can keep building. But I mean, with Ripon, for example, which I mentioned is known as the sinkhole capital of the UK, there's not really much that actually can be done short of just moving the city, which it's not a goer. And I think that's what's really scary about this is that there isn't actually a lot we can do to prevent it.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning as well, small ones can open up that I guess technically aren't sinkholes, but I know this from personal experience because outside my mum's house, a massive hole in the garden opened up, which was about 10 foot deep. And it turned out that was nothing to do with, you know, old infrastructure. It was to do with the old house used to have some sort of cold storage or cellar, you know, in the days pre-refrigeration from like 300 years ago. But for the same reasons, basically, rain, climate change, this thing just caved in and that was outside our house. The effects of climate change are happening all about us, Rebecca.
Yeah, and we can't really control, you know, when we're building new houses, we can't really control for the sinkhole risk for precisely that reason. So much of it is undocumented. You know, you might be able to find maps of Victorian era mines or earthworks, etc. But what you won't find are the hundreds of informal earthworks, mine shafts from centuries past. In that fatal incident in 1936 that Emma was talking about earlier in Norwich, that's an area underground is completely crisscrossed by disused flint and chalk mines that were used for hundreds of years, and people weren't leaving records of them and mapping them. They are just there under the surface. So it does make it very difficult, even with more bureaucracy, even with more, you know, surveying before works begin. We're never going to be able to identify all of those cavities.
No, but that answer of more surveying before works begin, Emma, I mean, that is kind of, I mean, that does seem inevitably what we're leading to, doesn't it? If there is, you know, if there are more instances of sinkholes, there must be some technology that can assess what's under your feet before you build a house on it.
Yeah, you know, things like scan surveys and stuff like that can allow us to have a greater awareness of what's on the ground underneath us. The case that you mentioned earlier about the children's playground in Buckinghamshire, turned out that it was above an old chalk mine. It was like a bell pit formation. It was incredibly deep and something that we didn't quite realise was there, and to the extent of how deep it went until there was this scan, which you know, was from technology from a few years ago. But I think that there is going to have to be a greater demand for, and there will be a greater demand for, greater assessment and to action to try and combat sinkholes, because even if people, I know I'm going slightly back on what I was talking about earlier, but people's lives are being hugely affected. You know, residents of Godstone were talking about how police were coming to their doors, giving them 10 minutes to evacuate, about how they might not be able to go back home for a few months ahead. You know, lack of access to medical facilities, pharmacies, local businesses being hugely impacted. People, you know, might not be being killed by sinkholes, but they are extremely disruptive, and people are going to want to make sure that they're safe and they're able to live their lives in a way that's free from this worry.
Harriet, it's your story of the week. Why? Why is it really important?
Well, for all the reasons that we've mentioned, so speaking to climate change, to scars of industrial past, to bureaucracy, to money issues as well. A lot of this is to do with financial issues. There just isn't the money to deal with them. But I think really what we were saying before as well, I think there's something incredibly primal about it. It's like something out of a Greek myth that this hole in the ground just appears and you're like peering into the underworld. It's terrifying, you know, and they are popping up all over the world. It's not just in the UK or, like we mentioned, in Guatemala. Last year, this Indian tourist vanished into a hole in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, leaving just a pair of shoes. And that is terrifying, but it is also, I think, it's such a perfect metaphor for how the ground beneath us just can't support our weight.
Up next, surely Saudi Arabia doesn't have any money left to invest in sport. You'll never guess what they do. That's after this. Okay, Emma, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, Saudi Arabia sank yet another billion into its sporting project.
We are here for something very, very special. This is the greatest fight card we've ever seen. The setting is the greatest stage we've ever seen as well. Look at that stage.
It's incredible. Every single time that we come here, it seems to elevate every single time. And this card that's been assembled is special. It's something that dreams are made of. This is Christmas, your birthday, everything rolled into one.
DAZN host Ade Oladipo and former boxer Darren Barker getting very excited before something in Riyadh on Tuesday. Emma, what?
So they were getting very excited by the arrival of various boxers on a card and a fight in Riyadh this Saturday, which is, you know, for those of us in the world of boxing is very exciting. But the reason why it's more interesting to a wider audience is because it's part of Saudi Arabia, you know, yet again flexing its muscles on the world sporting stage. And they've done that also this week by agreeing to invest another $1 billion in a global streamer, DAZN.
Yes. Rebecca, who are DAZN and why do Saudi want to invest $1 billion as a minority stake in them?
So DAZN, basically it's a streaming service and its goal is to be the Netflix of sports. It's based in London and it's owned by Len Blavatnik. He is one of those former Soviet Union billionaires that managed to make lots of money from the privatization following the collapse of the USSR. It emerged in its current form in 2015. It's the largest digital sportscaster in Europe. It also has a presence in East Asia, the Middle East, North Africa. It owns broadcasting rights to various markets for boxing, football, Formula One, the NFL. So, you know, it's no small potatoes. It's got 20 million subscribers. Here's the thing, though. It took in almost $3 billion in revenue in 2023, but it is loss-making. And not just a bit of a loss. We're talking a loss of $1.4 billion in 2023, which is actually more than it lost the year before. And basically, that's because it has to keep paying out huge sums of money to buy these broadcast rights. And Blavatnik can afford to bankroll it. Most recently, he invested $827 million. This is just the latest tranche of investment. He's thought to have invested $6.7 billion of his own money in it so far. And I mean, obviously, there is a logic to that. You can't build a streaming service that's going to become profitable without a huge amount of outlay to get the content people want to watch. But at some point, those losses do need to close, and you can't really give up rights, both in the sense that that harms the offering that you're putting out there, but also literally they can't. According to reports in the sporting press, they are already committed to paying out $9.4 billion in rights fees over the next few years. So they really need to start turning a profit at some point in the near future. Here's something that I thought was interesting. DAZN recently paid $1 billion for rights to broadcast the 2025 FIFA Club World Championship. The thing is, this puts him in the good books with FIFA. FIFA had been struggling to find a media partner before this, and $1 billion seems like a lot of money for the rights to something that no one else wanted the rights to. However, Saudi Arabia has now invested that same amount of money in DAZN. FIFA has awarded the 2034 World Cup to Saudi Arabia, so there has been some suggestion again among sports commentators that there is a sort of chummy, handshakey circle going on here between FIFA, Saudi Arabia and DAZN.
Yes, I've seen it suggested rather more explicitly than that on social media, but well skirted around. I mean, for your part, Harriet, do you see this as sport washing again? Or, given that Saudi Arabia, as Rebecca was alluding to there, have now invested so much money into sport, a genuine desire to diversify their economy?
It's both. So obviously, on the one hand, yes, Saudi Arabia presents its massive investment in sports over the last 7 or 8 odd years. I mean, it's been going back a bit further, but basically from 2018 onwards, it presents it as part of its vision to diversify its economy beyond oil. So they really want sport to kind of boost foreign investment, increase employment, encourage tourism. But also, yes, it's absolutely a sports washing situation. I mean, ever since 2018, Saudi Arabia has become this global player in international sports, spending billions and billions of dollars investing as part of its efforts to kind of distract from a very brutal and murderous regime. It's no coincidence that 2018, the same year that Khashoggi was murdered, that was their first big investment in an international sports enterprise when they signed a contract with WWE. The two big ones where Saudi Arabia is very legitimately accused of sports washing is football and golf. So obviously the big one that everyone will remember is when its public investment fund took over Newcastle in 2022. And then straight afterwards, Newcastle unveils their kit, their third away kit, which is like in the colours of the Saudi flag, even though FIFA says that they had these legal assurances that Saudi Arabia would not be controlling Newcastle, which obviously with Mohammed bin Salman listed on the chair as the chair of the public investment fund is kind of ludicrous anyway. And then also golf. I mean, they founded this LIV golf tournament in 2021, and it looks just like a standard golf tournament. And then it very controversially partnered with the PGA. We're talking billions and billions and billions in sport. They're losing a lot of money in it as well. I mean, just this month, this report came out to suggest that by the end of this year, they will have invested $5 billion. So yes, obviously there is an economic case to be made for diversifying away from oil and investment and tourism and blah, blah, blah. But yes, we can say that this is basically an attempt to legitimize Saudi Arabia on the world stage and distract from chronic social issues like torture, execution, sexual violence, arbitrary arrests, like all of the domestic issues that they have going on as well.
Yeah. I mean, leaving those sort of political or ethical concerns aside, which, as Harriet suggests, is exactly probably what they want us to do, Emma, as a sporting event itself, I mean, we heard, as I said, those boxing hosts getting very excited about the presentation of that match. Do Saudi host these events well? Are they better? Do they pour more money in and so the events are actually better for fans?
They certainly don't lack for scale. And I mean, you look at the plans that they're unveiling for the 2034 World Cup. I mean, they're off the top of my head, there's going to be 12 stadiums and 8 of them are going to be built from scratch. They include things like at the new city Neom, there's going to be one stadium that's built on like the side of a cliff, and just incredible amounts of, ambition, absolutely. And I think that they have sort of put in a lot into making sure that, these big sporting events, when, people come from overseas, they and when journalists come in, that they are sort of wowed and sort of, no expense spared. But it is interesting how Saudi seem to be making sure that things are on their terms a lot more than, for example, Qatar. For example, there was one of the big issues around building up to the 2022 Qatar World Cup, amongst other things, was the idea of fans being allowed to drink alcohol, and eventually. Initially, the Qatar organisers said that they were not going to allow that. They then relented and allowed alcohol to be drunk inside stadiums. For 2034, the organisers have already said there's going to be no alcohol at all, and they're sort of making sure that that's their, they're putting their foot down about, and it's very much.
That's a problem for sponsorship, isn't it, for FIFA? Unless you find other ways of giving lots of money to FIFA.
Exactly, but it's indicative that yes, Saudi. Are putting on a clean face to the world and showing how they can do this, but they're doing things very much on their terms, which is very interesting compared to things like Qatar, where there was a much more sort of, at least to an extent, a desire to sort of work with the Western world and sort of meet them to an extent. With Saudi, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting question, is that we are kind of stuck on this maybe outdated idea about what Saudi sports washing is and what it isn't. I think the conversation has actually moved on a lot from the very basic idea that they want us to like them, and so they're going to invest all this money in, changing their image in Western eyes. There is still obviously an element of that. They want investment from overseas, but thinking about Saudi Arabia's development in recent years and also the way the balance of power on the world stage is shifting, I think we do need to think carefully about Do Saudi Arabia still really care about softening their image to the West, or at least do they care as much as we continue to assume? What they're doing here is obviously, there's an element of propaganda, there's an element of branding, but is it really now about prestige and kind of cultural chest beating on the world stage rather than saying, we're the cuddly friendly Saudi Arabia? I don't know if they care if we think that anymore. They just want the eyes of the world upon them, and stuff like this is a guaranteed way to get that attention.
Well, on that, Harriet, I mean, if you look at the international talks that they've been facilitating in Saudi Arabia about Gaza and now about Russia, Ukraine, they've sort of achieved that, haven't they? They've managed to spell out, this is a place where you can have a conversation about these things. Everything's on the table because, we're friends to lots of big powers and you come here to do business. They've sort of successfully managed to put themselves in that place, not about oil, but about their position.
Well, that has been the case for a very long time. That's nothing to do with sport. That's to do with power. And that is also why we can't necessarily compare the situation with Qatar, because although Qatar is also positioning itself as kind of a mediator of peace talks on the world stage and a very also sanitized and legitimized version of the regime that was once known to be, it is not comparable. Saudi Arabia is a world power. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is arguably one of the 5 most powerful men in the world. It's not just about money either. It's not just about the fact that Saudi Arabia, with all this oil and with Aramco, their state-owned oil company, is one of the richest countries in the world. It is far more than that. I mean, as Rebecca said, the balance of power in the world is shifting and moving away very, very much faster than we might like to admit, moving away from the West, and very, very much faster than anyone wants to think about, away from the US and the West and more broadly. And Saudi Arabia, in that sense, is perfectly placed to kind of position itself in the middle of, like, yes, we can negotiate we can kind of speak on behalf of the Arab world, we can speak on behalf of the Arab League, it's certainly one of the most powerful in the Arab League anyway, but also we have kind of slightly starting to potentially think about normalizing relations with Israel. We're starting to negotiate a bit more with the US. We're starting to position ourselves as kind of more adjacent to China. It is about the nexus of power in the world ultimately, and sport is a very important part of that. I don't think that we should make the mistake of thinking that sport isn't a huge part of world power, because it is.
Sport helps present it to those countries' citizens, doesn't it? Even if the real reason behind it is power. If you're an American or a Russian watching your TV set, you might think, oh yeah, I watched the golf tournament from there. Yes, they're going to Saudi to have a negotiation. That seems like a good place.
It's more than just perception, though. It's more than just perception. Like, we're talking with big sport tournaments, international sporting tournaments, world leaders attend them. There is a lot of diplomacy that goes on in the background. It's a lot of soft power. It's also a lot of hard power, because it's an absolute fortune. Sport is one of the biggest financial powers in the entire world. So it is political and it is financial and it is like legitimizing a regime and perception and PR. But it's altogether what we're talking about ultimately is power.
Okay, just leaving the politics aside again for a moment, Emma, in terms of the actual technology, streaming platforms in this case, is that where the game literally is now? It's not about the big broadcasters anymore.
I think it's certainly heading that way. It's interesting that DAZN has previously described itself as the Netflix of sport, when Netflix is trying to become the Netflix of sport.
Yeah.
It's started to broadcast WWE, which is obviously sports entertainment, but sports in name, and it's started broadcasting some boxing as well. It broadcasts Mike Tyson, Jake Paul fight, which again is basically sports entertainment, but it indicates that Netflix is taking an interest in this. And we've had in the UK, Amazon has shown Premier League football, Champions League football, some tennis as well. You have DAZN, and Apple TV Plus have had a huge deal for MLS, the United States Men's Soccer League. So this is the way it's going, and I think it's interesting because the Premier League rights are up for grabs from the 2028 season onwards, and it seems incredibly likely that a major streaming platform is going to move for some kind of deal. I mean, Amazon have had some games, and I think that we are likely to see more and more major streaming platforms like DAZN, like Amazon, like Netflix get involved in broadcasting sport and make it much more of a priority for their businesses.
And ultimately turn it into profit, do you think? Because it's kind of like the one time we don't turn to streaming networks at the moment, isn't it? Despite those outlying examples, is live stuff. Something live is happening, you turn on live TV. That's still the case for most people.
Yes, and clearly this is what DAZN are betting big on. Clearly, Blavatnik and DAZN are hoping that they'll be able to make money back further along the line, get enough rights, and eventually they'll get enough subscribers. I think DAZN's issue in the UK is that they have a lot of deals, but they don't necessarily have them for stuff which is appointment viewing in the UK. They have things like Women's Champions League, they have boxing, they have some, non-league football, they have some other European football rights, but it's not stuff you're going to get a DAZN subscription for unless you're a big, European women's football fan or boxing fan.
Well, women's sport is an interesting avenue of this as well, isn't it, Harriet? Because, a lot of women's sports players and fans feel uncomfortable about any investment from Saudi Arabia because of the rights or lack of rights of women in that territory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of where I stand on it. But the women's football in particular, when FIFA announced this sponsorship deal with Aramco last year, which is the partially state-owned anyway oil company, Aramco, which is also the world's biggest corporate greenhouse emitter. So it's not just human rights grounds that women's footballers have come out and spoken out against the sponsorship deal with Aramco. It's also on environmental grounds. Their argument being that FIFA kind of positions itself, although for people like me, FIFA is a byword for corruption and sleaze, but for some people anyway, FIFA positions itself as like it's trying to make sure that it wants the game to be inclusive, it wants the game to lead by example, blah, blah, blah. So then the sponsorships should align with those views. But all of these women's football players last year have signed this open letter to FIFA, kind of begging them to drop Aramco as a sponsor because it gives Saudi Arabia the right to host the Women's World Cup, which is, for a lot of women's football players, would be really a huge, huge, huge problem. But also even the notion that the female footballers are going to be running around with Aramco on their shirts, given that women's rights in Saudi Arabia might have come a long way in the last 10 years. And that is true. You can be as cynical as you like, and I am, but they have come a long way in the last few years, but they're still, A, the record is beyond abysmal, and B, the situation is still pretty dire for women in Saudi Arabia, regardless of how far they've come.
Okay, up next, when it comes to another country and their international marketing, where could be less controversial than New Zealand? You'll find out after this. Rebecca, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Well, this was the week New Zealand seemed to be announcing a closing down sale.
Everyone must go. Interesting.
Everyone must go where? Is that the slogan?
It's pretty boring. Yeah, it's not really that exciting, I guess. Like, they could have thought something more creative.
I think everyone must come would be nicer than everyone must go.
Well, it sounds a bit confusing, really. It sounds like it could be like everyone's got to get up and leave rather than everybody should come, I think.
I don't think it's very clear, that slogan. I don't think it's great. Do you have any ideas for a better slogan?
We've got the better pies.
We got the better pies, he said there at the end, just so you know. Radio New Zealand asking members of the public in Auckland to react to what this week, Rebecca?
Well, classic thick of it antics, really. This is a brand new tourism initiative announced at a press event on Sunday by a beaming New Zealand Prime Minister Christopher Luxon, flanked by his tourism minister Louise Upston. Luxon called this another one of our Rolling Thunder initiatives to drive more growth into the New Zealand economy. What he was unveiling was a 500,000 New Zealand dollar ad campaign, that's about £227,000, targeted specifically at Australians. They are a major source of tourism to New Zealand. They account for about 50% of visitors, but they have struggled to get those numbers back up to pre-pandemic levels. Luxon, feeling himself in a way that is quite funny, knowing what's to come, told Australians they should get the bloody hell over here. Again, an unfortunate reference to Australia's quite memorable and successful "So Where the Bloody Hell Are You" tourism campaign. The alarm bells started ringing with the slogan, "Everyone must go." I mean, it makes sense in context because the messaging is supposed to be telling the Australians that New Zealand is this bucket list destination. And actually, Luxon said, again, somewhat unsettlingly, it would be totally and utterly tragic if those Australians don't get here before they do die. I'm glad they didn't let him write the slogan, if that was...
Come here before you die. Yeah. I suppose it's a twist on bucket list. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So people have found the "everyone must go" slogan a bit confusing. Some of them found it a little bit creepy, frankly. And also the posters for the campaign, they show, you've got like photos of visitors, sort of rapt visitors exploring New Zealand's beauty spots, but with sort of splashes on them like you get on a magazine cover saying sail on now, which A is weird and makes New Zealand look really cheap, and B, what sail? As several people have pointed out, it's not like they're offering an incentive for people to come to New Zealand. It's just like a really strange framing of what lots of people consider to be one of the world's, most naturally stunning countries to be basically turned into a supermarket flyer.
And it wasn't just that people didn't like the ad, was it? It's that this moment appears to have opened the floodgates to other criticisms as well from Kiwis.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about this, like in the wider sense, obviously it was funny, people have been doing viral mock-ups of it, but it's, this wider sense of how ready everyone was to sink their teeth into this campaign and really savage it. The response felt quite almost mean-spirited in a way that I don't think we tend to associate with New Zealand. It's basically this campaign has had the misfortune of coinciding with an aura of pessimism in New Zealand generally, and so it's ended up, everyone's glommed onto it, and it's become kind of a Rorschach test, and anyone can see it as symbolic of any of the host of issues that they have identified with New Zealand.
And what are those issues that people are complaining about in New Zealand, Emma, that perhaps we in other countries just aren't aware of, don't get much coverage?
Yeah, everything sort of like got brought up in relation to this campaign. The Green Party's tourism spokesman, Celia Wade-Brown, said that the tagline might refer to the needs for toilets in some of our high tourist spots. The queues are ridiculous. It sort of touches a nerve because tourism is a huge industry for New Zealand. Before the COVID pandemic, it was delivering more than $40 billion a year. And it is approaching those levels again, but there is sort of a feeling around New Zealand that things aren't as good as they were. And the fact that this has been particularly focused on Australia, the campaign was particularly focused on Australia because nearly half of New Zealand's tourism comes from Australian tourists. That struck another nerve because the campaign slogan is everyone must go, but that seems to have been an issue for the New Zealand population because the number of people emigrating from New Zealand, it rose to around 127,000 people who left the country in the year ending up to November 2024, and an annual net gain of only around 30,000 migrants, which is the lowest since the end of 2022.
Yeah, it's maybe surprising, Harriet, that they've recalibrated their tourism campaign at all, because they had a previously successful one, didn't they, in New Zealand, Pure New Zealand. But there have been concerns around that too, which maybe is why.
Yeah, this is going back to my days as a travel agent, but 100% Pure New Zealand is one of the world's longest running tourism campaigns and arguably one of the most successful, because they launched it in 1999 to kind of capture this spirit of adventure and incredible outdoorsy scenery and the sort of clean water and the pure green and the pure skies. And it was unbelievably successful. Even to this day, most people over here think of New Zealand in those terms. And they also kind of did a spin-off after the success of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. They did the 100% Middle Earth campaign, which again, it's brilliant marketing. It's super cohesive. Everybody associates New Zealand with those two things. They associate it with Lord of the Rings and they associate it with pure outdoorsy nature and scenery. It has come under a little bit of criticism because although people think of New Zealand as all clean and green and environmental, and it is true that there is really low pollution and strong environmental legislation, and it's like 26th out of the top 100 countries in environmental performance, it is also it's increasingly under fire because of the agricultural industry, which we've talked about on the podcast before. Agriculture and livestock farming is so terrible for the environment. And also the new government has sort of implied that they'll reverse this ban on new offshore oil and gas exploration. So accusations of a little bit of greenwashing there. It's worth stressing that it is still a pretty good country environmentally. It's just perhaps not as good as the slogan might lead it to be.
Yeah, well, I suppose at least in New Zealand's case, the thing that they're trying to cover up is also the thing that might draw you there. It's a picture of a sheep in either instance, isn't it? Rather than something that they're trying to divert you away from. Rebecca, there is a kind of fundamental paradox, I guess, isn't there? Which is, whatever your tourism campaign, actually, if this was successful, you are saying, come and visit our country, and that in itself is environmentally problematic. And so if you're trying to position yourself as a country that's highly sustainable, maybe you shouldn't have a tourism campaign at all.
Yeah, and I think that's what the Green Party were getting at with their dig about queues for toilets. They're talking about short-term tourism. So, a ferry pulls in, everybody climbs out to look at the scenery, queues up for, the one toilet that's available, gets back on, goes away. And it's this sort of pushing for lots of short-term visits rather than visitors staying for longer and maybe appreciating the country in a way that feels a bit more sustainable. Because those two things, as you say, they are on a bit of a collision course. You can't have a endless, relentless push to drive up tourism numbers and then also maintain that commitment to sustainability. One of the things that really sort of exemplifies this is the tourism levy, which was tripled last year. This is the amount that visitors pay when they visit New Zealand, and it's supposed to be used for conservation and sustainability projects. And Australians, by the way, don't pay this levy, but it's that levy which is funding this $500,000 ad campaign. That's another thing that the Greens have seized on. So that's just a microcosm of the fact that these two things, increasing visitor numbers and being the capital of sustainable tourism, are not going to be able to stay balanced indefinitely. Something is going to have to shift.
I don't know about anyone else, but the first thing that I thought of when I heard about this badly received PR campaign in New Zealand was to think about the flag referendum, which is another example of New Zealand getting its PR slightly wrong. A few years ago, there was a referendum on whether or not they should change their flag. And £27 million was spent on research, spent on advertising, it was spent on, polling, stuff like that, and it ended up with absolutely nothing at all being changed. The old flag beat the new one. There were complaints about, a lack of variety in the choices of flags. People could submit their ideas for what the flag should look like, which obviously came to some very creative and interesting designs being submitted.
Flag face.
If you don't remember Laser Kiwi, then I highly suggest you look that up. That should have won. That would have been that really should have won. But I think that maybe there's an issue of this also, touching a nerve with the people of New Zealand, who they are very unfairly often sort of divided as being, Australia's sort of like Australia, but further away or smaller. And whenever sort of the country sort of comes into the news spotlight, it's for stories like this, and I think that might have touched a nerve as well.
They also, though, Rebecca, as a nation, have, like we do, and there's a reason for that, obviously, historically, quite a sardonic kind of sense of humour, quite self-parodying. Does it matter what people in New Zealand really think of this advert when it's not aimed at them? It's aimed at Australians to come on holiday there.
Yeah, I like the vox pops at the start of the segment. Don't you think, New Zealanders are very funny and they don't get the credit for it? I think the Aussies take the credit for being funny in that part of the world as well. I think that the reaction to the backlash has been one of kind of bafflement. Christopher Luxon, the Prime Minister, said, as long as people are talking about it, obviously trying to put a bit of a smiley face on the whole thing. But I think that the board who developed it are right to be surprised that there was backlash, because as we've talked about, the backlash isn't really about the ad campaign itself. That's just sort of become the catalyst for a lot of grievances sort of bubbling below the surface. But I do think fundamentally the fact that this was designed to appeal to Australia is in itself, it's a touchy subject. There is a sort of fractious fraternal relationship between the two countries, and especially at this time, because the majority, this is concern in New Zealand about brain drain, about graduates leaving, white-collar skilled workers going abroad for opportunities, and most of them are going to Australia. And a poll in November found that 37% of New Zealanders had seriously considered emigrating to Australia in the past 12 months, and only 8% of Aussies said the same. So there's definitely a bit of an inferiority complex at play too.
If you were to create a tourism campaign for your hometown, Rebecca, what would your slogan be?
Well, I'm from a seaside town, so I guess mine would be like, time your visit carefully.
Don't leave your towel there.
Yeah, a quarter of the year to visit.
Yes. Harriet?
Well, I'm from London, so it's not perfect, but it makes everywhere else look crap.
Emma?
In the spirit of the final vox pop at the beginning, Whitley Bay, we got the better fish and chips.
There we go, nice.
Oh, I love Whitley Bay. I didn't know you were from Whitley Bay.
I am, yes.
Oh,
and we do have the
there.
better fish and chips.
You've got
Good
the
to
best
know.
Premier Inn in the whole of the UK.
Well, look, you can take Harriet Marston out, the travel agent, but you can't. Anyway, thank you for listening. Wherever you are, remember you can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. All you need to do is search for The Week Unwrapped. Type that in wherever you get your podcasts. And then tap follow, otherwise the endeavour is meaningless. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.